In this section, we're going to cover chemistry. Most of this is going to be definitions, so a great time to break out your note cards and put the term on one side and the definition on the other. I'd also recommend you pause the screen as you go through this, because I'm going to go through it pretty quickly because most of it is, quite frankly, just defining. Okay, be able to define chemistry. All these terms here, it'll be matching on the test, be able to define these. And element, atom, be able to define those, as well as chemical bonding, ionic bonding, and all these, be able to define that. Here's an example of ionic bonding. So keep in mind, ions are charges. We have positive charges, which are cations, and negative charges, which are anions. So opposites attract, so positive and negative will want to come together. That is your ionic bond. In this example, sodium and chloride are held together because of the ionic bond. That is the force holding them together. So when that happens, you get NaCl, or sodium chloride, which is your table salt. Be able to define covalent bonding and polar covalent bond. One thing about the polar covalent bond is the unequal asymmetrical sharing of electrons, as you can see there in this example with water, H2O, 2 hydrogens to an oxygen. We have a positive pole and a negative pole. Because of the unequal sharing, the electrons end up at one end of the pole. Another breakdown of what a hydrogen bond looks like. Okay, be able to define molecule, compound, dissociation. Going back to our NaCl, or sodium chloride table salt, if you were to put that in water, it will eventually dissociate, meaning separate. One of the reasons it's a weak bond, and when ionic compounds or the atoms that have an electrical charge separate, this is also going to allow for it to dissolve. So when this takes place, we get it dissolving in water, and that happens because of dissociation. Okay, be able to define chemical reaction, reactant, products, a synthesis reaction, decomposition. These down here that I have on these last several slides, these are just an example of what a decomposition reaction would look like. An exchange reaction, be able to define that on a test, as well as reversible and equilibrium. And these, define these as well. Energy, work, potential energy, and so on. I do want to focus on potential and kinetic energy for a moment. Potential energy is stored energy. Something's about to happen. Good analogy would be, let's say you're hiking and there's a big boulder that's right on the edge of the cliff, and it looks extremely unstable, and you can just tell that any second now that boulder is going to fall down the cliff. Well, it hasn't done anything yet, so that's potential energy. And let's say you go up to it and just give it a gentle push with your finger, just enough. It will now roll down the hill. That would be now turning into kinetic energy. Lots of that takes place in our body. We have lots of potential energy that eventually turns into kinetic energy. We do need the chemistry and the chemical reactions. They're necessary for food digestion, for growth and repair, for movement, heat production. Here's an example of movement and heat production and our fuel, our energy, and that's ATP. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the phosphate group is attached to an ADP molecule. So ADP is adenosine diphosphate, di is 2. So you can see up here, we have the, here's an example of the ADP. Up here you're seeing the ATP, so there's your 3 phosphate bonds. This is a high energy bond, so if it's broken, you have energy that is released. So now it's broken down from 3 phosphates, also known as triphosphate, into the diphosphate or 2 phosphate groups, because this has been broken off. Our body uses this method over and over again, repeatedly, to literally fuel us. This is our energy. So after a phosphate is broken down into the diphosphate, eventually that phosphate is reattached. So here's your potential energy that when broken will turn into kinetic energy. Be able to define these as well, matching on a test or multiple choice. This is a big one. A catalyst is something that speeds up a reaction. An enzyme is a great example of that. In the presence of an enzyme, reactions occur very quickly.